You react the same way every time, and you don't even notice it. The reaction you think is you. You don't have bad reactions, you have old ones. That distinction matters more than it might seem right now. Because the way you've been framing this, as temperament, as personality, as just the way you are, has made it invisible. And invisible patterns don't change. They just keep running, in the background of every relationship and every difficult moment, doing exactly what they were designed to do, long after the design became obsolete. Think about the last time you reacted in a way that surprised you. Not a catastrophic moment, something smaller. A tone that came out harder than you intended. A defensiveness that arrived before you'd finished listening. A withdrawal that happened automatically, without a decision, before you even registered that you'd pulled back. And afterward, maybe a few minutes later or the next morning, you looked at what happened and thought, why did I respond like that? That question is more important than most men realize, because the honest answer is almost never about the situation itself. The situation was just the trigger. What fired was something older, a response pattern built in a different time under different pressure by a version of you that needed to react that way to manage what was happening back then. The problem is that you're still using it, not occasionally, consistently, across different contexts, different relationships, different decades of your life. The same pattern keeps showing up, wearing whatever costume the current situation provides, feeling every time like a completely fresh and justified response to what is actually happening right now. It doesn't feel like a pattern from the inside. That's the critical thing to understand. It feels like you. It feels like clarity or self-protection, or an accurate reading of a situation that genuinely required that response. The pattern is sophisticated enough to bring its own justification, and that justification arrives so quickly that it feels like it was there before the reaction, not after. Epictetus spent his entire life pointing at this, not at emotions as problems to be solved, but at the automaticity, the way human beings hand over their responses to systems that were built in the past and never updated. He understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having no control over external circumstances, that the most dangerous loss of freedom is not the one imposed from outside. It's the one you never noticed happening inside. You are not your reactions. But until you can see the gap between what happens and what fires in response, they will keep feeling like the same thing. That gap is what this is about. How the pattern gets installed. No one builds these patterns intentionally. That's the first thing to understand. Because if you approach this as a failure of character, as evidence that something went wrong with you specifically, you will miss what's actually happening. These patterns are not mistakes. They are solutions. Intelligent, efficient, well-calibrated solutions to specific problems that existed at a specific moment in your life. The nervous system learns. That's its primary function, not to feel, not to think, but to learn what the environment requires and to produce that response faster and more reliably over time. When you were exposed to a situation that carried real emotional cost, conflict that felt dangerous, criticism that felt definitive, closeness that came with unpredictable consequences, your system registered it. It catalogued the features of that situation, the tone of voice, the emotional temperature, the specific kind of pressure, and it built a response designed to manage that cost as efficiently as possible. The first time it was a decision. Conscious or not, there was a moment where a particular response worked. It reduced the threat, contained the damage, allowed you to keep functioning. And the system noted that, filed it, made it faster the next time, and faster the time after that, until the response became automatic, until it no longer required conscious input, because conscious input is slow and the system had learned that speed mattered. This is not dysfunction. This is exactly how a well-functioning nervous system is supposed to operate. The problem is not that the pattern was built. The problem is what happens when the environment that required it no longer exists, but the pattern keeps running as if it does. Seneca wrote that most men are haunted not by their enemies, but by their own habits, responses so deeply grooved by repetition that they no longer recognize them as choices. He was describing this precisely. The pattern stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something you are. And once it feels like identity, questioning it feels like self-destruction. But here is what the pattern never received: the signal that the original threat had passed, that the environment changed, that the person who needed to respond that way is no longer in the situation that required it. The system is still running a program written for a context that no longer exists, and it will keep running it until something interrupts the automaticity long enough for a different response to become possible. That interruption doesn't come from willpower. It comes from something much more specific and much more demanding. Why you always think you're right when it fires. Here is what makes this particularly difficult to catch. When the pattern fires, it doesn't announce itself as a pattern. It doesn't arrive with a label that says, "This is an old response built for a different situation, running on outdated information." It arrives as reality, as an accurate reading of what is actually happening right now, as a completely justified response to a situation that genuinely requires it. The reaction comes first, the reasoning comes second. But the reasoning comes so quickly, within fractions of a second, before conscious awareness has had time to fully process the situation, that it feels like it came first. It feels like you assessed the situation, drew a conclusion, and then responded accordingly, in that order, rationally, deliberately, appropriately. That sequence is almost never what actually happened. What actually happened is that your system recognized a pattern in the environment, a tone, a word, a facial expression, a dynamic that resembled something it had learned to treat as threatening, and fired the response before your conscious mind finished processing the input. By the time you're aware of what's happening, the reaction is already in motion. What your conscious mind does then is not assess the situation. It constructs a justification for a response that has already been chosen. This is not a flaw in your reasoning. It is how the brain operates under conditions that feel emotionally charged. The justification is real. You're not lying to yourself. You genuinely believe the story your mind constructed. But that story was assembled in service of a response that was already happening, not as a neutral evaluation of what the situation actually was. Marcus Aurelius returned to this repeatedly in the Meditations. He wrote about the discipline of examining first impressions, of not simply accepting the initial interpretation the mind offered, but pausing long enough to ask whether what seemed obvious was actually true. He called this one of the most demanding practices a man could undertake. Not because the initial impressions were always wrong, but because they were so convincing that they rarely got examined at all. The pattern is most dangerous not when it feels like a pattern. It is most dangerous when it feels like clarity, and recognizing that, understanding that the certainty you feel in the middle of a reaction is not evidence that the reaction is right, is the beginning of something that Epictetus called the only real freedom available to a human being. What Epictetus called the only real freedom. Epictetus was a slave. Not as a metaphor, not as a philosophical thought experiment, he was owned. He had no control over where he lived, what he did, or what happened to his body. By every external measure, he was a man with no freedom at all. And yet he became one of the most precise thinkers in history on the subject of human liberty, precisely because his circumstances forced him to locate freedom somewhere that no one could take it from him. He found it in the space between what happens and what you do with it. This is the opening of the Enchiridion, the first thing he wanted his students to understand before anything else. Some things are in our control. Some things are not. External events, other people's behavior, the circumstances life produces, not in your control. Your interpretation of those events, your judgment about what they mean, the response you choose to make, entirely in your control. Always. Without exception. Most people read this and hear a call for emotional detachment, a stoic in the colloquial sense, unmoved, cold, above it all. That is not what Epictetus was describing. He was not asking you to feel less. He was asking you to notice that between the feeling and the action, there is a gap. And that gap is where everything that matters actually happens. For a man running automatic patterns, that gap has effectively closed. The stimulus arrives and the response fires without anything happening in between. Not because the gap doesn't exist, it always exists, but because years of repetition have made the path from trigger to reaction so fast and so grooved that the gap is no longer accessible in the moment. It happens too quickly to interrupt. What Epictetus was teaching was not a concept. It was a practice, the daily, deliberate work of reopening that gap, of training yourself to insert a pause between what happens and what you do, until the pause becomes reliable enough to use even when the emotional charge is high. He was a slave who understood that the one thing his owner could never control was the space between perception and response. And he spent his entire life teaching free men that they had unconsciously surrendered that same space, not to an owner, but to their own unexamined patterns. The freedom he was pointing at was never about the external world. It was always about this, the moment before the reaction becomes inevitable. That moment is yours. It has always been yours. The question is whether you've learned to use it. The cost you stopped counting. At some point you stopped adding it up. Not because the cost disappeared, because it became background, a constant low-level drain that you normalized so completely that you stopped experiencing it as loss and started experiencing it as just the way things are. The tension that follows certain conversations, the distance that opens up after certain reactions, the moments where you can see clearly and too late that something unnecessary just happened, and that you were the one who made it happen. The cost of automatic patterns is almost never paid in single large transactions. It accumulates in fractions. A reaction that was harder than the situation required takes a small amount of trust out of a relationship. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough that over months and years the balance changes. A defensiveness that closes a conversation before it could become something real. A withdrawal at the exact moment when presence was what was needed. A response that was calibrated for a threat that wasn't there, and that created one in its place. In your closest relationships, the cost is intimacy. Every time the pattern fires and the other person receives a reaction that wasn't meant for them, wasn't about them, wasn't proportionate to what they actually did, there is a small recalibration on their end. They learn below the level of conscious decision to approach certain subjects carefully, to avoid certain tones, to work around the pattern rather than into it. And slowly, without anyone deciding this, the relationship loses a degree of depth it might otherwise have had. In how you lead, whether at work or inside your family, the cost is trust. People follow presence, not performance. And a man who is partially running on automatic is never fully present. Part of him is always in the past, responding to something that happened then in a context that no longer exists. That absence is felt, even when it can't be named. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man who cannot govern himself cannot govern anything well. He wasn't speaking about discipline in the conventional sense. He was speaking about this, the capacity to be actually here, actually responding to what is actually happening, rather than to a version of events filtered through patterns that were built somewhere else. The cost you stopped counting is real, and it's worth counting, not to produce guilt, but to produce clarity. Because clarity about what the pattern is actually costing is what makes the next question feel necessary rather than optional. What is it still protecting? And is that protection worth what you're paying for it? What the pattern is still protecting. Every automatic pattern protects something. This is the part that requires the most honesty, because it's easier to see the cost of a pattern than to see what the pattern is trying to prevent. The cost is visible. It shows up in your relationships, in your reactions, in the aftermath of moments that didn't need to go the way they went. But what the pattern is protecting lies underneath that, quieter, older, and far more specific than it appears on the surface. The defensiveness that fires when you receive criticism is not protecting your ego in the abstract. It's protecting a very particular wound, a specific experience or a repeated experience where criticism meant something more than feedback, where it meant you were insufficient, where the person delivering it had the power to define your value, and they used that power badly. The pattern learned, when this kind of input arrives, close the door before it gets all the way in. And it has been closing that door ever since, in conversations where the door didn't need to close, with people who never had that kind of power over you, in moments where the feedback was accurate and would have been useful if you'd been able to receive it. The withdrawal that happens when things get emotionally close is not protecting you from vulnerability in a philosophical sense. It's protecting a specific place where closeness once came with a cost, where opening fully meant getting hurt in a way that left a mark. The pattern learned, when the distance closes past a certain point, something bad becomes possible. And it has been maintaining that distance ever since, with people who never posed that kind of threat, in relationships that could have gone deeper if the pattern hadn't intervened precisely at the moment when depth became available. The anger that arrives too fast, harder than the situation required, disproportionate in a way you can feel even as it's happening, is not protecting you from disrespect in the present. It's protecting something that learned under specific conditions that a slow response to certain kinds of provocation had real consequences. That hesitation cost something. That speed and force were necessary to survive a particular kind of environment, and that environment is gone. But the response it produced is still here, still calibrated for a threat level that the current situation almost never actually contains. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man who examines himself honestly will always find beneath his strongest reactions something he has not yet been willing to look at directly. He didn't write this as criticism. He wrote it as navigation, as the only reliable map toward the kind of internal clarity that makes genuine choice possible. Not the clarity that comes from understanding the pattern intellectually, the clarity that comes from sitting with what the pattern is actually protecting long enough to feel it, to recognize the specific, human, entirely understandable place where it was built. Because that recognition changes something, not the pattern itself, not immediately, but your relationship to it. The pattern stops being evidence of what's wrong with you and starts being evidence of what you survived, of what you learned under real conditions when you needed to learn it. And that shift, from self-judgment to honest seeing, is what makes the next step possible. The pattern is not irrational, it never was. It is the intelligent response of a system that learned, under real conditions, that certain kinds of exposure carried real costs. The problem is not that it learned this. The problem is that it is applying this lesson universally, in every situation that carries even a surface resemblance to the original, regardless of whether the actual threat is present. Regardless of whether the person in front of you has any of the power that the original person had. Regardless of whether this moment, in this relationship, in this decade of your life, has anything genuinely in common with the moment that built the response. The pattern never learned to ask that question. It was never designed to. It was designed for speed, not discernment, for protection, not precision. And it has been answering a question, is this dangerous, not with the same answer in the same way since the day it was built. Seeing this clearly does not dissolve the pattern immediately, but it changes what the pattern means. Because once you understand what it was protecting, really understand it, not just as a concept but as a human experience that made sense at the time, you can begin to ask the question it never learned to ask for itself. Is the threat actually here, or is the system responding to a ghost? That question is not rhetorical. It is the most practically useful question you can learn to ask in the moments that matter most. And learning to ask it reliably in real time before the sequence has completed is exactly what the next part of this is about. How to use the gap before the pattern decides for you. Everything in this video can stay as understanding. And understanding by itself changes nothing. That's not a disclaimer. It's the most important thing to say at this point, because the temptation after a video like this is to feel that the insight itself was the work. That naming the pattern, recognizing the mechanism, understanding where it came from and what it costs and what it's been protecting, that doing all of that constitutes a change. It doesn't. The pattern doesn't respond to being described. It doesn't hear the explanation, register the logic, and quietly stand down. It responds to something more fundamental than knowledge. It responds to practice, to the repeated deliberate interruption of the automatic sequence, in real time under actual conditions, until a different sequence becomes not just possible but natural. So this is where it becomes concrete. The Stoics had a practice they called prosoche. The translation, attention to oneself, doesn't carry the full weight of what they meant. They didn't mean self-reflection in the abstract. They didn't mean the periodic review you do after something goes wrong, the morning journal entry, the occasional audit of your behavior when the consequences become undeniable. They meant something continuous. A sustained real-time quality of witnessing, watching yourself as you move through your life, noticing the impressions as they form, catching the interior movement before it becomes an exterior action. Not as a performance of self-awareness, as a genuine practice of seeing. Marcus Aurelius did this every morning, before the day began, before the empire required him, before the decisions and the campaigns and the people who needed something from him. He sat with his own interior. Not to produce inspiration, not to generate motivation or construct a better version of himself before the day had even started. To prepare the gap. To remind himself, deliberately and in writing, that between what the day would bring and what he would do with it, there was a space. And that space was not automatic. It had to be maintained. It had to be chosen again every day, against the pull of a mind that would rather react than reflect. He failed at this regularly. The meditations are full of evidence, written in his own hand, never meant for anyone else to read, that he lost his patience, that he misjudged situations, that he responded from something older and less considered than the moment required. He wrote about this without self-pity and without excuse, not as confession, as record, as the honest documentation of a man who understood that the practice was not about achieving a permanent state of clarity. It was about returning. Returning to the gap, returning to the question, returning to the discipline of seeing clearly every time the pattern ran without him. Every single time. That's the first thing to understand about this work. It is not a transformation that happens once and holds. It is a practice that happens in the small moments. Moments that don't feel significant until you miss them and then see, too late, exactly what just ran on automatic. For the specific work of interrupting reactive patterns, prosoche has a concrete entry point, and it begins earlier than most people look for it. By the time the reaction is fully visible, by the time the tone has hardened, the defensiveness has closed the door, the withdrawal has opened the distance, the pattern has already completed its sequence. There is nothing to interrupt at that point. What you can do is observe the aftermath, register the cost, and use what happened to prepare differently for the next time. But the interruption itself requires catching something that happens before the reaction reaches the surface. It requires learning to recognize the early signal, the specific physical marker that precedes the response. For most men, that signal lives in the body. It arrives before it arrives in conscious awareness, A tightening in the chest, a sudden narrowing of attention, a particular quality of tension in the shoulders or jaw, a shift in the breath that happens so quickly it barely registers. That physical sensation is the pattern announcing its activation. It is the nervous system moving into the automatic sequence. And it is the only reliable point at which the gap is still genuinely accessible. The only moment in which something other than the predetermined conclusion is possible. Learning your specific signal takes time. It requires a quality of attention directed inward that most men have never developed with any consistency, because nothing in the way most men are formed rewards that kind of interior observation. But once you know it, once you can feel it with enough reliability that you recognize it before the sequence has completed, everything that follows becomes possible. What you do in that moment is not complicated. You don't need to analyze the situation in real time. You don't need to identify the origin of the pattern or trace it back to its source while the conversation is still happening. You don't need to produce a better response immediately. You need to do one thing: insert a pause. Not a suppression, not a performance of calm laid over something that is still firing underneath, which the other person will feel regardless of what your face is doing. A genuine pause. A moment in which you hold the impression before allowing it to become action, in which you remain inside the gap long enough to ask one question. Is what I'm responding to actually here? Or is the system responding to a resemblance, a surface similarity between this moment and something older, something that required this response in a context that no longer exists? That question does not always produce immediate clarity. Sometimes the situation is genuinely ambiguous, and the honest answer is that you don't know yet, but the act of asking it is itself the interruption. It inserts consciousness into a process that was running without it. It transforms something that was happening to you into something you are, however briefly and imperfectly, choosing. And that transformation, small, unglamorous, requiring nothing dramatic, is precisely what Epictetus meant when he spoke of the only real freedom available to a human being. Not the freedom to change your circumstances, not the freedom to redesign the conditions of your life or escape the situations that carry charge. The freedom that exists in the space between what happens and what you do with it. The freedom that no one can take from you, and that you can surrender unconsciously 100 times a day without ever noticing it's gone. The reaction you keep having is not who you are. It is what you learned under real conditions when a version of you needed it. That version was not wrong to build what it built. It was responding intelligently to a real environment with the resources it had. The pattern protected something that deserved protection. But you are not in that environment anymore. And the man you are now, older, more capable, in possession of a kind of self-knowledge that version didn't have access to, has both the capacity and the responsibility to respond to what is actually here. Not to everything at once, not perfectly, not without returning again and again to the same practice after the same failures, because that's what the practice is, not a destination. A direction. The daily, unglamorous, quietly demanding work of choosing, one moment at a time, to be present to what is actually happening rather than to what the pattern insists is happening. In the next conversation that carries a charge, the signal will arrive, the gap will open. And for a fraction of a second, brief, real, entirely yours, you will have the choice that has always been there. That's where it starts. That's where it has always started. Not in the understanding, in the moment. And if you made it to the end of this video, something in it probably landed somewhere real, not just as an idea, as a recognition. Most men don't go looking for this kind of content unless something in them already knows it's time. So subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. I read every single one, because most of what gets made here starts there, in what you share, in the things that are difficult to put into words, in the experiences that don't fit neatly into the conversations most people are willing to have. You're not the only one living with this in silence. Thank you for your presence, for your attention, for the time you chose to spend here today. See you in the next one.